Okay, the point I was trying to make here is that we need to begin to ground our understanding and reading of Old Testament material, legal material, in story and in covenant. Okay, so this is going to be this has to be one of the big takeaways for you all today, and I'm going to be spending a little bit of time talking about that. Okay, so the one thing that scholars, modern scholars, are very quick to point out is that legal texts in the Old Testament do not stand alone. Okay, they do not stand alone, but they are embedded in the context of story. So if you read Duval and Hayes, this is what they say: the Old Testament legal material does not appear by itself in isolation. This is an important observation. The Old Testament law, therefore, is different in the way it is presented than, for example, a book such as the Proverbs, right? The book of Proverbs appears somewhat in isolation from the other texts. It is not connected to story because it's wisdom distilled from life experiences and normally packaged in short sayings, maybe like up to 25 words along those lines, right? Very short, pithy sayings. That is what the Proverbs are all about. And it's very, almost timeless. Again, you need to look in context also, okay? But I find that really, really interesting that here we have them saying that law must be read in the context of story. Let's move on. The Old Testament law is firmly embedded in the story of Israel's theological history. It is part of the narrative that runs from Genesis chapter 12. Remember, Genesis chapter 12 is the call of Abraham, and God wants to use him to be a blessing. But first, to bless him so that he can be a blessing. This is not the missional history, right? Israel's theological and missional history. It is part of a narrative that runs from Genesis chapter 12 all the way to 2 Kings chapter 25, because in 2 Kings chapter 25, we find the people going into exile. And the blessing for them to have land, and then the blessing of them losing land. I say blessing of them losing land because it's part of the lesson that God had for God's people. You know, that is the theological history that we need to learn from and that we need to embed our understanding of law in. The law is not presented by itself as some sort of timeless universal code. Rather, it is presented as part of the theological narrative that describes how God delivered Israel from Egypt and established them in the promised land as his people. Okay, so I'm looking at the back at somebody from Singapore Bible College who is the head. She's the chair of the Student Mission Fellowship. And so missions, the missional history and the theological history is so critical because that is the context within which we need to situate our understanding of law. And from that flow our practices, and from that flow our beliefs, right? I cannot say enough that Israel's history is not just theological, but it is missional, all right? Israel's history is missional. And because of that, we are a missional people, and the laws help us. Later on, I will talk about this from Chris Wright's book, that it shapes us for that missional purpose. Okay, I cannot say enough of that. Okay, so understanding that missional purpose and missional history and theological history is important. The question, however, for us is, do we know that missional history? And it's often that gap in our Bible literacy that for that not understanding, we miss out so much, right? We don't live our lives full in the fullness that God has invited us and called us into as His people, because we don't know that history. I'm so glad that we are all gathered here, in numbers also, because it basically means that there's a hunger in our spirits for us to want to know more about that history. The same when we go into New Testament epistles, for example, you need to know the history, and you need to know the narrative, the historical situation within which, for example, the New Testament letters were written. When you understand that, your aha moments will just light up. Okay? And that's why I love to take people over on Bible Lands tours, because it's over there we open up the context within which we understand the whole situation, how the law or how the scriptures, how the letters apply in that situation. Okay, so Duval and Hayes go on to show how the laws how the laws of Exodus are embedded in a larger narrative, just as the laws of Leviticus and the laws of Deuteronomy are. So I put story in the back just to help us to remember that when we read the law in any part of the Bible, the Old Testament, we must remember that they are given in the context of story, and later on we'll talk about the context of covenant. Okay, so we are all familiar. So let's just start with Exodus. Okay, we are all familiar with Exodus, and here's a little bit of trivia fun. Okay, a bit of Exodus trivia fun. What is 40 divided by 2? And the answer is, intelligent people, 20. And what is 20 divided by 2? Okay, so there are 40 chapters in the book of Exodus, and when you divide 40 by 2, what do we get? Right, so in case you didn't know this, there are 40 chapters, but you divide that, you get chapter 20, which is where you find the 10 commandments. You all remember very well, right? I teach your Sunday school kids. Okay, so back to the point. Okay, so back to the point about law embedded in story and to the giving of the law in Exodus. Now, I want you to note that there are 2 points. I'm kind of simplifying our understanding of Exodus, but there are 2 high points that we find in the book of Exodus, and they are integrally related. Yeah, they're just tied together. So you cannot just read the 10 Commandments without understanding what happened before and what happened after. And the before is really important. I call this the 2 high points, the twin peaks of Exodus. Okay, if you don't remember anything about Exodus, you must remember these 2 points. That there are 2 high points in the book of Exodus. The first is God delivering them from slavery in Egypt and leading them out to cross the Red Sea in chapter 14. That is the first high point. And the second high point, I don't know whether it is the higher point, but the second high point is the giving of the law, which we find on Mount Sinai in chapter 20. Now, the giving of the law, and I'll say this again later on, is linked to the deliverance story. They obey in gratitude for deliverance from oppression, from terrifying moments, from certain death. Now, we cannot just read the giving of the 10 Commandments in isolation. It is oppressive, it is demanding if you read it that way only. But if you understand that they were just taken out of a terrible, terrible, terrible situation, and now they were invited to be a part of a community, to live in a particular way under the lordship of God, of Yahweh, because there are going to be many other competitor gods around, and already up in the mountain, while Moses was up in the mountain, Already they were playing around with the golden calf down there. Okay, so we already know how the influence of culture was going to impact the people already. So this is a high point, the receiving of the Torah, the instructions from God, right? Which is life-giving, which is meant to be life-giving in the midst of death-promoting culture that they just got out of, and a death-promoting culture that they will soon enter into. You need to understand that. Okay, it is valuable, it is life-giving. And so that's really, really important for us to understand that law is embedded in story. How about Deuteronomy? So I'm going to skip Leviticus because of time, but you can read all of that in Duval and Hayes, because you have the book. But how about Deuteronomy? Now, Deuteronomy is very interesting because the word Deuteronomy is actually derived from two Greek words, deuteros, deutero, and nomos, which is law. Right? Literally means the second law, but it really should be understood as a second reading, or the second declaration, proclamation of the law. So it's kind of repeating what was said in the old covenant, the first reading, but applied to a new context. Okay, so the first reading we find was to a generation up in Mount Sinai. You can see up there, or down there, sorry. Here is Mount Sinai, right at the bottom. Okay, so that's the first reading. It was to a generation in Mount Sinai after they had this experience God's deliverance and the Red Sea crossing. But that generation had failed. Now that was a generation that they passed into the wilderness and they failed. They disobeyed God. So already the character of God's people going through the wilderness, the unwillingness to trust God, rebellion against Moses, etc. This is a generation that was dying off or had died off. This is a new generation now. And after all their wanderings, now they are camped here on the eastern side, not in the western side, because they are going to cross the land into the land of promise, which is over the side. They are now here, camped on the plains of Moab, all ready to cross. Not yet crossed yet, but it's on the plains of Moab, on the eve of the crossing, that we have people, the people of God, a new generation, they gathered to listen. It was very interesting that, the call for them to do or to listen was almost the first priority. Remember what we said last week about 2 weeks ago about Achan and Rahab, right? That compare contrast story. Now, if you remember Joshua chapter 1, Joshua chapter 1 is a constant call for God's people to hold the word of God in front of them, right? Not to forget, right? The emphasis is just unmistakable. Right? It's almost like the first priority is not to cross, but the first priority is to listen. And that's why I love Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6, those passages, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, it's called the Shema. In Hebrew, it's called the Shema. And if you ever go to Israel, in every hotel that you go into that takes in Jewish clients, there is a little Shema thing, shin, that they put on the right side. And that's really derived from, they kind of nail it inside, and the Torah is found there, right? Because we find in Deuteronomy chapter 6, the command to nail, to teach their children, but to nail it onto the doorpost, right? So they take it literally. They take it literally. But what I find interesting about Deuteronomy chapter 6 is that, it is a command for us to, what's the emphasis of Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4 to 6? Hear Israel, the Lord, God is one. You then, and then, love, you shall love the Lord. Now, a lot of people say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, soul, and mind. And then the other one is, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, so people always say, love is the big thing. I say no. I say no. I say, the greatest command, or our first duty, our first response to God is not to love Him. Uh-oh. Is it recorded? I've said this many, many times to many, many public groups, to my students, etc. Your first duty as God's people is not to love, but to listen. Because Shema actually means listen and keep. Right? And if we do not listen properly, we love wrongly. Right? If we do not listen properly, we love wrongly. Because if we don't listen and we kind of half-past listening, we listen to our intuitions and our bending towards sin, and we say, oh, God said it's okay, But if we listen carefully, by giving your full attention to what God really says, it's a different ball game. Like I always say, discipleship is not about bringing home a puppy, right? Because the puppy, you change your lifestyle, but the puppy is still you're still the master of the puppy. It's like bringing home a master. When you bring home a master, everything changes. And so your first duty is to Shema, to listen. And if you go to any Israeli hotel, you find the sign there. It's a great reminder for us. Shema. Right? So if anything I want to leave with you all today from Deuteronomy is to listen. And the listening involves listening to the history. Your fathers, your forefathers, so God did this for your forefathers, they've strayed away. But your new generation, you are going to enter into the new land. It's going to be full of snares and enticements. What are you going to do about it, right? So listen, and the giving of the law is for people to listen and obey. And before they enter, they need to do all these things. So, second generation, they are encamped here. And before they cross over, they need to stop. I'll say that again. My lips are a bit dry. They need to stop. They need to stop and listen. Okay, so that's really, really an intuition, a lesson that all of us need to learn. We need to stop and listen to the story within which stop and listen to the law, but even more so, we need to stop and listen to the story that undergirds the law and the giving of the law. Okay, so I think that's really, really important. Again, law is given within the context of the story. It is the context of the story that gives the law its meaning and its intention. Okay, so that's the one thing I want to leave with y'all in terms of narrative. But secondly, we want to talk about covenant. And the question is, what is covenant? Now, I think I better put some water in my mouth because this is going to be a bit long and maybe dry. Okay, any questions? Maybe it's a good time to take questions. Or share a thought. Yes. Yeah. Over here. Oh, there's a mic coming, yeah.
Thanks for sharing today. Coming from National Day, I I have two thoughts that I want to share. I think the first one is, I think living in Singapore is very blessed because we have this thing called the life giving law, which is taking care of the vulnerable. I think in Singapore we do that. And I like what you say about Deuteronomy, it's actually second reading. So in terms of the parliament, they also have a second reading of the laws. So I thought that I live in a very blessed country. Yeah, even though it's secular, but it has a lot of spiritual undertones. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, I'm so grateful you flagged that because, I know a lot of us travel, and when you travel to different parts of the world, you realize coming back that we are actually very privileged. Okay, there's a lot of protection laws, there's a lot of even in the dementia space, interestingly, I was just talking to Professor Kwa Yi Hyok, who's a really big name in psychiatry. And you're saying that, the Singapore situation is so interesting because there's so many volunteers. The people committed to good, community good, so many from all the different religious groups and secular groups, etc. Whereas he was comparing with Finland and some of the other places that they have to pay people money to, to volunteer these, to offer services. That's why he was making a comparison between Singapore and some of these other so-called Western developed countries, where the spirit of volunteerism, the commitment to public good, common good, is very high in Singapore, and we don't realize that. We don't realize that. Okay, I'm very grateful for that, and in many ways, then Singapore becomes a light to the nations because a lot of these policies and initiatives are actually driven by Christians, not only by, but a lot of the Christians are really driving it in all the different arenas in society, right? So it's actually law translated into practice. It's a bit like the aircon, right? When the aircon is working, everybody don't notice, but you enjoy it. But when it is not working, which you will see in a lot of other countries, that's where you begin to appreciate the quiet behind the scenes operation of good law in practice. Thank you. Yeah. So we are really a blessed nation. But what are you blessed for? And that's something that we want to look at later on also. Okay, thank you so much for making that comment. Yeah. Anybody else? Maybe one or two other, just to break the monotony. Yeah, my go-to question asker.
Kelvin, just want to ask, in terms of the narrative context, if you, Kelvin, I just want to ask, under the narrative context, what is the danger of us misinterpreting the stories and thus then misinterpreting the law?
Do you have an example in your mind?
I don't have, unfortunately, but I'm just thinking that, for example, at the giving of the law, and then Moses comes down, sees what's happening with the golden calf situation. He smashes it and then goes back up and gets the same law written again and comes back down. What's the difference? Does that mean that the law is immutable even in all the situation? Could we read it in such a way to see that's what happens? This law is conflated. What are we to take away from the story in which this law was given to us?
Yeah. I think, how do I respond to that? I think the example you gave about the law given, and then in spite of the giving of the law, we find that God's people, they are already, to me, that's the irony and the beauty of literature, right? Here we have a high point in their lives, a sacred high point, known only to, I guess, Moses. I mean, not known to the people, right? Because the people are down there. And from the narrator point of view, he's giving to us perspective that the people don't have, right? And we are tracking with God and Moses and the giving of the law is such a significant point. And then at the bottom, the people are committing idolatry, right? The great irony, which also fuses together the nature of human nature, the propensity and the tendency to, like the hymn says, our bent to sin, right? It's our bent towards sinning versus the goodness and the greatness and what God is trying to do. I think when you hold the two in tension, it's a really beautiful lesson to learn from. Right? And again, if we understand the story that way, I think there are some really great insights. But of course, you can take it in another way. If you don't read it in this story context, you say, "Oh, God gave and then God broke." You can extrapolate interesting applications out of that, which may not actually flow so much from the point of the narrative and the law in narrative. Yeah, because it's really the narrative that is really, really informative. Yeah. But I think, if I may just pull out something out of your question, which is reading the law out of its narrative context. Maybe you can read the context in the wrong way. So, last week I mentioned the revisionist views in narrative, right? I talked about the Three Little Pigs, right? And then the revised version of the Three Little Pigs where we shift point of view. Well, that's actually happening a lot too, right? So a lot of our narratives today are revised, and so I think there was a sister that shared about some progressive expressions of Christianity today, where we can say, oh no, the stuff from the Bible is that culture, and today our culture, it doesn't apply anymore, right? And certain laws, whether it's human sexuality or whatever, there are many reinterpretations and applications. So I've struggled a lot with that too, because just within the LGBTQ community alone, there are, and I would say that that's the only community. I would say that, in the fiery women's right, the woke community, anything that has got to do with identity politics, whatever identity you want to raise up as, you're oppressed, we were oppressed, but now we want to raise that particular community up. The term that we often use in Bible college is hermeneutics, which is the art and the science of reading scripture, right? So I always say to my students, we never see the world as it is, and this is actually quoting a rabbi. Stephen Covey also quoted that rabbi. I forget the name of the rabbi, but we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are, right? We never see the world as it is, we always see the world as we are. Meaning there's something about ourselves that colors how we read the text or read the world, okay? Then I'll give you an example. If I were wearing a pair of lenses and they were pink, I would see, isn't it clear to the world? Isn't it clear to you that the world is pink or green, right? Because I see the world through my lens, okay? And if I see the world through the lens of the hurt that I've gone through, everybody in this room is an enemy, or everybody in this room is a competitor, or everybody in this room is out to hurt me, right? So we see the world through our lenses. Now, brother, sister, you look at the world in a different way and then you come to a different conclusion. How does it apply to the scriptures? It's the same, right? We never read the scriptures neutrally. Right? We never read the scriptures neutrally. So part of it is, so in biblical studies, we have this thing called reader's response, where however you read, however you feel you read, it's fine. The author intention is not so important. Right? So you can take Shakespeare, you can read whatever, you read it however it is. Okay, so can we take the will that your father left for the family and read it in the way that reader response? So brother A, brother B, brother C, brother D, and you read it in your own way. Right? Actually, our father intended this to be all mine, right? In spite of what he said, but actually the real intention, So then you can make yourself or your community the final arbiter of what is truth and what is right. Right? So we are moving into what we call hermeneutics and the different lenses through which we read the scriptures, and this is equally true in how we read legal material or any other part of the Bible. You see where I'm getting at? Okay. So in the more, I wouldn't say advanced studies, but when you go into Bible college and you want to prepare for that, we will drill through with you all, go through with you all this kind of thing, because eventually these are the sort of perspectives that people in the church and outside the church, they have a lot of questions coming out of this. Okay, this sort of thing. So generally, we try to help you with understanding not just the content in the scripture, but how people's relationship with the scriptures, how they even approach reading the scriptures, how they can, reader A, reader B, reader C, reading the same scriptures can come up with very diametrically opposite views and conclusions. Okay, so all this is happening. This is a very real issue. You touch on very deep, heartfelt issues, which are the reasons why people are antagonistic towards the church and why our young people are leaving the church. It's all related, in case you didn't realize that. Even some of us who read the scriptures in a very uncritical way, but very super devotional, you love the Lord, you whatever you read, you say this from the Lord. Sometimes there may be some faults in how we are reading. And that's why what I'm trying to do in this class, and I think what your church pastors are trying to do through offering classes like this, is maybe to give us some handles and some perspective on reading the scriptures better. Okay? Thank you. Okay, back to covenant. Okay, so what is covenant? Covenant is not derived from a name of a big church in Singapore. They borrowed that term from what we find in the Bible. Okay. Oh, sorry, my church is also covenant, but it's a smaller version. Okay. So the question is, what is covenant? Right? Now, in her 2021 book, All the Covenants of the Bible, this lady, Jessica Parks, she writes these words. Right? A covenant is a contractual agreement between two parties. The agreement is often ratified by a binding action such as an oath from one or both parties. Many of the covenants in the Bible are between God and a person, but covenants between human beings were also common. Now, I remember back in the 1980s, that was a long time ago, when I was young and when I was in Bible college, right? My professor, I remember he took us into the world of the culture of the surrounding. So this is the culture of the worlds that the Old Testament was embedded inside. Okay, so it was the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Egyptian culture, and we explored Babylonian and Assyrian political covenants between the conqueror king and the conquered kings. Now, the terms that I learned from them, I think, were very, very interesting and very helpful, and that's why I'm sharing it with you. So, what we learned then was that the superior power is called the suzerain, technical term, right? And then the lesser power is called the vassal. And I think many of you probably will be familiar with at least with the term vassal. Those of you my generation, because I think in our history, we learned that, our growing up history books, we all learned the term vassal, right? Not the boat vessel, V-E-S-S, that's a different one, okay, the vassal. So I already, as a primary school kid or secondary school kid, I already knew the term vassal. I didn't know suzerain when I went to Bible college, right? But the superior power is called the suzerain, and the lesser conquered power is called the vassal. Okay? Now, formal agreements were exacted by the suzerain on the vassal, and they would therefore be called the suzerain-vassal treaties. Now, formal agreements that were made between equal powers were called parity treaties. Okay, parity treaties. So, two different types of treaties: the suzerain, a vassal treaty, and then the parity treaties. Now, my prof would then go on to tell us that Old Testament covenant making was actually similarly, that means what we find in the Old Testament, the covenants, was similarly modeled after the format of the suzerain vassal treaties. And he actually went on to show us, these are the formats and the terms of reference and the points that you find in a typical ancient Near Eastern treaty. Then he showed us, if you look at Exodus and Deuteronomy, the format is very similar, so he showed us and we are going, wow, really, and we thought it was really interesting, so there was a bit of a modeling after something which was widespread in the larger culture of the time, right? Well, the thing is this, when we look at Old Testament law, we find that, it's actually, the terms of reference are set by the suzerain. And it's not like a parity treaty, because, you must understand that God, the God of heaven and earth, who rules the entire universe, would you expect that a covenant made between that God and we puny beings, would you expect it to be a parity treaty? Of course not, right? It would be a suzerain vassal treaty. And we need to understand that context very, very much, because, I really cringe sometimes when we sing those songs about God being friend. I think there's one facet of the friendship of God, but I think the one thing that we so often miss out is that God is not your friend, buddy. God is not your friend, buddy. Right? God is your king. God is your prime minister. I mean, if in the presence of your prime minister, do you pray? I mean, come on. In the presence of royalty and the highest authority in the whole wide world, how do you posture yourself before in the presence of such? Of course, as a friend, you relax a bit, but God is not just your friend. And I think sometimes we miss that point about who God is in how we posture ourselves in prayer, in conversation, etc., in worship. So if God is your creator, your sustainer, your deliverer, I won't expect any of the covenants that were made in the Old Testament to be parity treaties. Okay, that will be treating God as your equal, as your buddy. So it is important for us to know that when the laws were given, the terms and conditions and reference, terms of reference for living and interaction were given by a suzerain. Okay, suzerain, it makes a big difference. Okay, understanding that really makes a difference. So, including in the covenant were instructions of the vassal to follow, that the laws promoted a certain culture and a certain ethic which were consistent with the character and the values of the suzerain. You need to understand that the laws flowed out of the character of who God is. And so Duval and Hayes write, God introduces the law in the covenant context, saying, now if you obey me fully and keep my command and my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. The people agree to keep the terms of the covenant, and Moses seals the agreement in blood. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. I hope you appreciate what Duval and Hayes are the point they're trying to make here. When God made the covenant with his people, it was expressing a relational commitment to his people. It is not as though we have this 500-pound gorilla grabbing the person by the collar and saying, sign on the dotted line or I'll pound you into a pulp. It's not that way. Not that way, okay? Here we have a relationship of love by the suzerain according value and worth, treasured possession. Out of all the people, you are my treasured possession. According value and worth onto the vassal. Duval and Hayes therefore go on to write, part of this covenant was God's promise to dwell in Israel's midst. This is stressed several times in the latter half of Exodus. Dwelling, God dwelling in our midst, that's really amazing. The presence of God is a big theme in Old Testament studies. We definitely cannot miss that, should not miss that. The presence of God is so comforting. On the relationship between law and covenant, what they go on to write are these words. Since the Old Testament law is tightly intertwined in the Mosaic covenant, it is important to make several observations about the nature of this covenant. Number one, the Mosaic covenant is closely associated with Israel's conquest and occupation of the land. The covenant provides a framework by which Israel can occupy and live prosperously with God in the promised land. Okay, framework by which Israel can occupy and live. Remember, I said last week, or the last time we met, not ownership. They don't enter the land to own the land and live by their own laws. They enter the land to steward the land by God's principles. That's a big difference, okay? If I own, I do whatever I want, it's my right because I own. Here we're saying, hey, God owns. You are only a steward. And how you steward, you are accountable to God. That is a big, big, big difference. Okay, and I think today, as we want to live our lives as the people of God, I think we need to remember that completely. The blessing, number two, the blessings from the Mosaic covenant are conditional. A constant warning runs through Deuteronomy, explaining to Israel that obedience to the covenant will bring blessing, but that disobedience to the covenant will bring punishment and curses. Now, I will end later on with this thought. And then the other point is that one ahead too much. Number three, the Mosaic covenant is no longer a functional covenant. I mean, for the traditional Jews, they still, for them, there's no such thing as a new covenant, the way we think of a new covenant. So the other covenant that we still share is still in operation, right? So it's a bit different in how we are viewing the lens, the interpretive lens that we are reading the scriptures will be very different from how more religious Jews would read the same scriptures. So the Mosaic covenant is no longer a functional covenant. The New Testament believers are no longer under the old Mosaic covenant. Point number four, the Old Testament law as part of the Mosaic covenant is no longer applicable to us as law, applicable over us as law. Paul makes it clear that Christians are not under Old Testament law. Now, this does not mean discard completely. My point is that there are theological principles that we can still draw out of them. Okay? Not binding in a thoughtless or, the context is still residing in then, but we need to rethink in our new context. And then we must interpret the law through the grid of New Testament teaching. Now, with that, what I want to do is I want to skip over the rest of the chapter and introduce us to... I should have put two, actually. So I think this should be in under covenant. What I want to do is I'll skip over the rest of the chapter. So you look here, we have the interpretive journey and the conclusion and the assignments. I'm going to skip all that because of time. Instead, what I'm going to do is to introduce us to another book which I think will help us to appreciate the Old Testament law so much more positively. Now, the title that I want to, because I know you all like to read books, right? Yes. The title of the book that I want to introduce to you all is How to Preach and Teach the Old Testament for All Its Worth. I think somebody mentioned, Fee and Stewart, how to read the Bible for all its worth. This is kind of like following in the style of an extension, but this time by Dr. Chris Wright. Now, the book covers how to preach and teach story, law, prophets, Psalms, and wisdom literature. So technically, I could have based this course on Dr. Chris Wright's book. And Dr. Chris Wright is actually one of my favorite authors and a great influencer in my own thinking. So whatever he writes must be right? Another one of my favorite guys is Dr. Tom Wright also. So, the Wright brothers, they're not quite brothers, but they're both Brits, bless their souls. Now, in his latest book, so I don't give you just one, I give you two, right? Yes. From Dr. Chris Wright. But in his latest book, I really love this latest book, the 2003, maybe it's not his latest, but in one of his later books. The Great Story and the Great Commission, participating in the biblical drama or mission. Now, he shares really, really helpful insights about the place of the law in the Old Testament story. Let me share. My own work, he writes, on the purpose of the law in Old Testament Israel includes the observation that it was given in order to shape Israel into a community that would reflect the character of Yahweh, enabling them to be the public, visible exemplar of God's intention for a redeemed community of God. So the legal text can be interpreted with this sense of their mission within Israel's society. The mission of Israel was to be a light and blessing to the nations. The mission of the law was to shape Israel for that task. Wow! I don't know whether you've actually thought of this before, that God's people have a mission. I've said that many times to you. I'm sure Pastor Joe and Pastor Yong Beng have made that point many times. We don't live for ourselves. As a people of God, we live for a greater cause, a meaningful cause, to be God's light to the nations. But the law has also got a mission, which is to shape us for that mission. Okay, so when you see it that way, and I just love Dr. Chris Wright for the way he has put it, to help us to think more, get that perspective, I think that's just amazing. Now, for Dr. Chris Wright, knowing the larger story from beginning to the end, from the creation story. So, hello, my friends. The Bible doesn't start with the story of the fall. The Bible doesn't start with Genesis chapter 2. The Bible starts with the glorious creation story. And so creation, and the Bible ends with a wonderful picture of the new creation, the new heavens, and the new heaven and new earth, when the both will be fused. I have a lot to say about this. I have a lot to say about this, okay, because a lot of my work now is with seniors, and when you're talking about seniors, you're talking about, hey, what's next, right? What's beyond the grave? What's on the other side of the grave? And when we pass on to the next life, it's not going to be us playing our harps, floating as bodiless spirits. We're not. That's a very Platonic idea. We are going to be given, the heaven and earth are going to be fused as one physical entity. Okay, we're talking about physical entities. We're not talking about some airy-fairy spirit, So who you are, what you do, your physical, how you take care of people, that all matters. Okay, the story begins with creation. It ends with creation. Right? It doesn't begin with the fall. And so the end goal, the thing that we want to look forward to, is the restoration of the earth. Right? So therefore we need to always incorporate Genesis chapter 1 into our thinking. It's not just about fall. Right? It's the restoration. So if you look at Genesis, it's really about the fall. It's the creation, the uncreation. And so did you ever realize that even the separation of the water, so I'm going outside of my scope now, but the separation of the water and the land, the separation is a creation of boundaries. But when the flood happened, we have the uncreation, and the boundaries were blurred. Because the moral boundaries were also blurred then, right? So and this is really kind of looking at the text from a literary analysis point of view, right? The uncreation that we see when the floods overwhelm the dry land, the boundaries are broken, right? The boundaries between land and sea are broken. It's really to mirror the brokenness of the moral boundaries that happen. And that's a really beautiful picture. So in Genesis, we have the creation, and then we have the uncreation, and then we have the continuing story of the recreation. And the law has got a big part in that recreation story. Okay? So it's a redemptive story that we need to work through. So the mission of the law was to shape Israel for that purpose. So like I said, for Chris Wright, knowing the larger story from the beginning to the end is important. From creation to the fall, to redemption, to the end when all will bow before the King of Kings, when he triumphs over all evil. That is the missional story. And knowing how the people of God fit into the missional story and understand that law shapes God's people for that mission, that's really important. For Dr. Chris Wright, the correct lens through which we should interpret the law is story, redemptive story. Right? Not saying anything different. And law is grounded in story, law is grounded in covenant. Okay, so that's what he says in that book, but back to this book, so the other book is also worth reading, but this book, I'm gonna draw some lessons from this book, because in this book, in the chapter Understanding Old Testament Law, chapter 9, Chris Wright provides 5 points about Old Testament law, which I really feel are worth thinking about, and I will spend the rest of my time for today looking at the 5 points. And the 5 points are that the Old Testament law was praised as the gift of God. Old Testament law was given to people who had experienced the grace of God. Old Testament law was given to shape God's people for the mission of God. We already had a little glimpse of that. Old Testament law reflected the character of God, and then Old Testament law expected judgment of God. Okay, we'll elaborate on that. Is it time for a break yet? Not yet, no. You tell me when. 10-15 more minutes. Okay, very good. Tahan, huh? Okay, so Dr. Chris Wright points to a very positive view of the law when looked at by the devoted within the Old Testament community. And so we find these words from him. Devout Israelites, Israeli and Israelites, there's two different people. Israelites refer to the people that are referred to in the Bible, the Old Testament, and maybe in the New. But Israelis refer to the modern Israel entity, and the people who are citizens of the land of Israel, which could be Jews, could be non-Jews, Arabs, they're also Arab Israelis. And there may be some Filipino, I don't know whether they is given to any of them rights, but they live in there. Okay, so Israelites, devout Israelites, delighted in the law as a gift of God's grace and token of God's love given to them for their own good. They saw it as a blessing in itself and the means of enjoying God's continued blessing. They recalled that the revelation of the law to Israel was a unique privilege granted to no other nation. They urged one another to obey it, not in order to be saved, but because God had already saved them. They delighted in it as a fruit to life and as the river of fruitfulness. So there's a lot of Bible verses in your own time. Maybe you can just reflect on that, read them and reflect on that. So that's the first point, that the Old Testament law was praised as the gift of God. And certainly Psalm 1:1, famous Psalm, Psalm 1:9. Psalm 19 is also a very beautiful psalm, which also praises the Torah, the law. But Psalm 119, I will say this later on in the other session, but Psalm 119, just give you a taster. Psalm 119 is an acrostic psalm. And A for apple, B for baby, C for cow, D for donkey, it's a A, B, C, D, E, F, G song. Okay, Psalm 119. So imagine the Torah is written from A to Z. What does an A to Z word remind you of? Or what does it signal to you? Right? I've gone through the A to Z of life. It's like completeness, right? Isn't it? It's about completeness. And to celebrate the Torah and its beauty and its benefits as in a poetic form, so that you have your first 8 verses in Alpha, 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 Aleph, 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 and then the second verses, cluster of verses, B, 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 they all start with the letter B, and then the third one with Gimel, which is the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet. How many letters are there in the Hebrew alphabet? English, 26, Hebrew, 22. Okay? So good to know, huh? Right. So my point is this, even the form of that particular psalm celebrates and praises the Torah as the gift of God. That sentiment is something which is certainly found in our scriptures. Okay, and you can go and read through all the other different verses which are given to us. But second point, that the Old Testament law was given to God's people who have experienced the grace of God. Now, when you think about it, it's actually very similar to the New Testament when Jesus said in John's Gospel, if you love me, then you will keep my commandments. Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. Because it is a command relationship that is born out of love. Yeah? It's born out of love. It's not born out of duty. It's born out of love, right? So keeping the commandment is because of love and because, and this is very important, of gratitude. Okay, of gratitude. When you are grateful, you realize that the person has done something for you that really has made such a difference. Uplifted you, saved you, and without that person's input, life would be so much more terrible. Okay, so similarly, when the law was given in Exodus chapter 20, it was after the people were delivered from the years of slavery in Egypt. I already made this point earlier on in the 2 high points in the book of Exodus. You need to think about it. You know, these are years of oppression, of abuse under political powers. And these political powers did not value human life at all. You know this if you read the Exodus account when they were under slavery. And even more so because they were foreigners, they were displaced, and they were vulnerable persons. You know, they were oppressed people. Okay. Now now they are delivered and they are given this new constitution by which they would live their lives. And the constitution would be designed for them to maintain justice and righteousness and kindness and goodness under the lordship of Yahweh. And this is why Chris Wright writes, grace comes first, obedience comes second. As the proper response to grace, grace comes before the law. Okay, grace comes before the law, and it's captured in this picture. Grace is captured in this one high peak, and law is captured in the second high peak. Right? Grace comes before the law. Okay, so law is kept as an expression of gratitude. Now, the third point is that law was given to shape God's people for the mission of God. And on this point, Chris Wright says, let's take a break. You all like it, right? So let's take a break. Okay, so let's take a break at this point, and then after that we can have a bit more, and then we'll have discussion. Pastor, but I think, like I promised you, those who say finally, sometimes they finish, and I will finish, okay? So I want to leave this with you, because overall today what we talked about, I gave you some terms, apodictic, casuistic, you can figure that one out. But also made the point that law needs to be grounded and interpreted and made meaningful in story and in covenant. It's important for us to know that story. It's important to know that covenant in order for us to situate that law, those laws, in context. And then to draw principles out of those laws. But the 5 points, and this is going to be the homework part, right? The 5 points that Dr. Chris writes about, that the law is to be praised, was praised, and is to be praised. It was given to those who had already experienced the grace of God. It is given to shape us in a particular way for God's mission for us. It reflects the character of God, the ethical monotheism thing, and we need to be more in line with that. And number 5, that judgment. The law presumes judgment because it is familiar, it is aware, it is mindful of human failings. But failure is not the final word, because the grace of God, which was the reason why you wanted to obey in gratitude, continues to be in operation even after you fail. Okay, so I want to leave those perspectives for us to think through the mechanics of how you work through each passage on the Bible about law. It's a different story. I think today, probably the big takeaway I wanted to leave with you all is perspective. Right? Is perspective, rather than the mechanics of how you read one particular law. But because if you have that perspective, when you come back to individual laws, it gives you a different idea, a lens through which you process that law. Okay, I'm going to open up for questions. I think there must be a moving mic or something. Please, while I drink some water. In the meantime, you all can stand up and stretch a bit, you know.
There's a question.
Can I ask my question? Yeah, thanks for sharing. Going back to the migrant workers, right? Agree on the treatment to the migrant workers that we should be kind to them. My question is, how do you deal with injustice from their part? In the sense that, let's say, a migrant worker fraud against you, as an employer. I understand that God is a mitigator, right? Yeah, but how do we deal with the internal angle?
Yeah. So if you've been in any human space, it's not just migrant worker space. A couple of years ago, I went to London, right? And then we were in the immigration, and then the immigration department, there were migrant people who were running the show. And I would have thought that, as migrant workers, they go through the whole system, they would be more charitable and they would be kinder in how they treat non-whites like us. And they were definitely not white, quite the opposite. But they were treating the migrant workers in their midst like they were high and mighty, and there's so much power exercised over us. Okay. Now, the reason why I share this is because I've seen migrant brothers, supervisors, who take cuts, because they can make decisions about who can stay back, whose contract is renewed. I can renew a contract, but for a fee, right? And so I think in my mind, Yaki, now your own people, you're all in the same dilemma, and here, just because you have a bit more power, you are treating your own people like dirt, right? And like you don't value people at all, right? Now, you have to remember that we are people who claim the name of Jesus, and we want to align ourselves with the values, which, like I said earlier, can be quite countercultural, quite radical. Right? But the rest of the world doesn't operate on the same standards. It's a dog-eat-dog world, right? It's a survival world. And so if those people come here, maybe they're also thinking of their family. They're thinking about, what's a quick way of me getting the debt that I owe to all the loan sharks. Just get rid of it very quickly. This is a great way to do it on enterprising, right? So I see that happening. I see amongst own people treating their own in a way that, to me, not acceptable. The question that you're asking is, how do we deal with that, right? I think for those people, again, this is a grace versus go hard on them versus, mitigating circumstances, be kind, be gentle on them. I don't think there's a right answer until you study the actual facts of the case, and then you make a judgment for that specific case. I don't think we should try to aim at a generic answer because that wouldn't work at all. But I definitely want to acknowledge your point because it is real. It is real. Okay, we do have Singaporean doctors also who are making some money out of some inappropriate kind of ways of making money out of that whole ecosystem of need, right? So we see that, and there have been people who have been struck off the medical one of the list, and so on. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that for us as people who seriously take our faith, who take our faith seriously and want to make a difference, we can, right? Earlier on, I talked about I talked about Jubilee, right? I talked about Jubilee, and I also mentioned, I think I mentioned to one or two of you all in the sidebar conversations that there in 2000 during SG60, now SG50. 50 is very, very significant, right? Because of the Jubilee year, right? So a lot of Christian believers, I don't know about in your midst, but I was so aware of so many Christians who were doing debt cancellation efforts, right? And there were all sorts of very interesting initiatives that were happening in order to serve the migrant brothers and sisters well. Yeah. Now, I would say that because, it's like I'm an ukulele player, right? So I say 10 years ago, ukulele was very, very popular. No, not very popular anymore. The same for issues in Singapore. Migrant issues were so hot, like not so long ago, but today it's a bit quiet, right? I think it's a bit quieter, partly because some of the issues have been dealt with more, but if you dig deep, they're still there. They are still there. Transport, road safety is one of the big issues that has not really been resolved. We were already raising the concern so many years ago because you see, what's that got to do with the Old Testament law? It has everything to do with the Old Testament law. Because policy at a national level is meant to protect and provide for the vulnerable. And very often they're not. That's why we have NGOs. Some of them, they bang their fists a bit harder on the table. And the government doesn't really like to work with that kind. But if you work with the government quietly behind the scenes, they are actually very willing to listen. Yeah. Yeah. But sometimes banging works out. Sometimes not. Yeah. Yeah. Because the point is you want to bring the voice of the exploited group or the underserved group or the vulnerable group to the table, and sometimes people don't listen to you. So sometimes bang 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 helps a bit, right? You just somebody got to be the bad guy. Yeah. So the other interesting thing is advocacy. Advocacy for rights and justice. This is a thing that a lot of Christians don't go into. But it's really interesting, coming out of the 1 week of workshops and seminars and talks that I just came from Taiwan. We were talking about transformation and being relevant to the context. Now, yeah, again, you have to remember that Singapore, no poor in Singapore, right? There's no poverty in Singapore. Now, I'm being a bit naughty. Yes and no, because our social safety nets are very strong. Okay, our social safety nets are very strong, but it's not the same in many other countries. So, coming from those other countries, we find that government support is not as strong as what we have here. The infrastructure is not there. So, the groups that are at the forefront making a difference in terms of protection, in terms of, okay, we don't have sex trafficking in Singapore, at least we don't. Is there? It's under the table, But explicit, very, very in your face type in the Philippines, in different parts of the world, is very out there. And a lot of the Christians are out there making a difference, you know. Making a difference of one person's daughter is a big deal. It's really a big deal. Okay, let me think about it. If that was your daughter, what would you do about that, right? So wouldn't you be very grateful for groups who are practicing the law, right? Who are reflecting the nature of God and not just being inward looking at your own church community, but really looking out in society and really making a difference. For the first time in my life, never heard so many seminaries saying that was part of their DNA. They really want to reach out to the people out there. I've never, we're always talking about this academic ivory tower, but never in my life have I heard so many groups, saying they were going there, this part of what the programs. I even saw one statement that said, every faculty member is an exemplar of social transformation. I'm going, wow, I want to be in your school, man. Yeah, I mean, okay, there's a lot of work, but can you imagine the sort of radical thinking that's happening out there? Right? So I'm really, really encouraged by what I saw and felt and the people I talked with and the stories. And I wanted to share a little bit with you because, you mentioned migrant, it could be any other demographic, but for example, the special needs community is another one of the vulnerable groups. Maybe the foreigners in your midst, maybe like the students from other countries who come, who are, they're lonely, they're lost, that kind of thing. Maybe there's something that can be done for and with them also. It can be any demographic. Wherever you are is your mission field, right? Including your home, including your neighborhood. Right? As God opens your eyes to see, the question is, how can some of these ideas and the laws that we read of, how can they move us into action, to be God's light to the nations? Okay, that was a great question that provoked too long an answer. Can we have maybe another question which will provoke a shorter answer? Thank you. You're supposed to get into your groups and discuss also. Wait, any other questions? Quickly think in your head and get ready to answer.
Yeah, just want to before the break, you mentioned that you said that God is not our friend, something like that. So if you know where I'm coming from, New Testament passage in John 15. But now we are discussing about the Old Testament. So are you making this statement in relation only because we are talking the Old Testament, or in general, the whole Bible? So
whenever I say things from here, please, I like to provoke people out. I like to say extreme things, right? But you need to understand that while I'm saying this to one crowd, I will sometimes say this to another crowd. What I'm really saying is that don't have too low a view of God in your mind. If God is only your friend, the way your buddy sitting next to you is your friend, if you only know God at that level, then I would say that you are living in spiritual poverty in terms of understanding, because God is so much more than just that. So I'm not saying anything more than just any more than what I'm saying. Okay, I'm not saying that God is not our friend. By the grace of God, by His accommodation to our humanness, He incarnated Himself. You know? So the whole idea of incarnation is already a step down in order for God to come to our level. And He did. And He went beyond coming to our level. He showed us a different way of what it means to be human. Right? Obedience to God, servanthood. Right? So if God is your friend, then learn the things that He wants you to learn as He comes to you as friend. And I want to suggest to you that the friendship with God will challenge your values. Right? It will challenge you to live your life at a level and a standard that is beyond how you would normally live if you did not meet this friend. But this, you must understand it from the term of reference of the friend, rather than from your own perspective. Okay, what he's trying to do with and for you and to you as friend, rather than, hey, he's my buddy, you know, and then you name drop, and then you know, do all the things that you normally would do, but using the friend to accomplish your cause, right? Like I said, it's not about bringing home a puppy, because that's that kind of mentality. You know, we often talk about, you know, God is our divine Masula, God is our divine ATM, God is our divine butler, you know, and that's really, and that's what I'm trying to move us away from. That, you know, when I say God's not just your friend, because I see so many people I see who claim the name of Jesus, treat God exactly like that. The friend idea is really, God is my butler, God is my ATM, God is my Masu. But is God really that? Is that all God is? Right? So if we understand a bigger vision of God, I tell you, you know, there are people who met God, including God, who is Jesus' best friend in the Bible? John. When John encountered Jesus in Patmos, what did John do? He fell down like a dead man. Can you, I mean, like Isaiah encounters, you know, in the vision, Isaiah falls before God, you know. So the thing is you know, if you need to understand that this friend is not just an ordinary friend, right? Right. So yes, I'm not against the idea of friendship with God, but I'm also trying to say on whose terms. On whose terms. Okay. Thank you for that question. I appreciate that a lot. We have another one. Janice over here.
I have a question related to the discussion that you want us to have.
Oh, sure, please.
My question is related to the discussion that you are asking us to do. I just want to kind of have you do the homework for us. You know, like for example, the first question, the first discussion was pick one of the laws, and it was from Exodus 34:26. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. How are we as peasants and plebeians know how to interpret this law in the context of what you have just taught us? Could you give an example of how to interpret this law correctly?
Normally I would say, that's a difficult question. But in this case, I would say thank you for asking that question, because that was a question that I talked to one of you all I talked to outside just now. Remember at the beginning I said to you all about the story of my invitation to share a meal with a rabbi, or rabbi in training. This is back in the 80s when I was Bible college student. I studied in England. So in England, you have a lot of Jews, at least in the area that I lived in. So it was very interesting. So the story is I went to study I went to rabbinic school to improve my Hebrew. Right? I met this guy, and then he was very hospitable. He invited me to his home, and we had meal with his wife and my wife. And the father was around. So it was very interesting because I was clueless. I didn't realize all these things, but I realized at that meal something was happening that to the naked eye you don't know what's happening. Okay, so they have a law, they have a rule that the Jewish people, the Jewish community, they have this rule which relates exactly to this. Right? It's an extrapolation, it's an extension of their belief to what the scripture, the first one, chapter 34, which says about not cooking a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay. Now guess what? We had chicken. We had chicken for dinner. And then when it came to coffee time, they never serve milk in the coffee. Why? Because the chicken milk. Exactly. Right? Exactly. If ever you go to Israel, you have a hot, say you travel, we go on a Bible Acts tour, right? At night, you never find milk. You never find milk, right? Why? Because meat and milk never mix. Goat milk, camel milk, chicken, goat meat, chicken meat, camel meat, whatever it is, beef, whatever they are serving, no milk. Where does the milk come from? Normally either cow or goat, right? So regardless of what kind of meat, including chicken meat, they don't mix at all. So in this family, homemade chicken. And then the father said, can I have some milk in my coffee, right? And then there was a lot of kicking under the table. It's like the rabbi's son in training is signaling to the father, who's probably a non-practicing Jew, right? That cannot, this is taboo, right? So what I learned that day was very, very interesting, that within that community, how they interpret this is they've taken it to like an elevated next level of hedging and protection, right? So that the way they're reading the scriptures is that they've put so many, what we call hedging, right? They've put so many hedges around the law to make sure that it doesn't happen at all. Okay, but they've taken it to the next level. And I think this is really the form of Judaism that a lot of the modern, even within their own community, they struggle with that. And of course, those who don't practice, in the New Testament, New Testament Christians, we don't take that seriously. Now, my answer does kind of illustrates a shade of interpretation, but it doesn't answer your question, right? It doesn't answer your question. So your question relates to the context in which this law was written, right? And I think it's important to understand that, within the Canaanite context, right, this idea of boiling, cooking a mother's milk, it was really a Canaanite practice, religious practice, that God's people were called not to be like. So it's really not the elements of milk and cow and goat and mother, but it's just a practice that, it's like a call for God's people not to be like them. Right? So the theological principle is we shouldn't be tripped over by the little details. It's a larger principle that's in operation. Okay? But it was a bit amusing for me, as I'm sharing the story, I'm just recalling how people sometimes can take laws bring it to the next level. And before you start laughing, we do that ourselves too. Right? We do that ourselves. And I think it's very important for us to understand the context within which the laws are written and try to draw out the correct applications. And I think the same applies for tattooing. Now, I hate to say this because tattooing is a big, difficult issue for a lot of people. Right? And we pull from the scriptures many Bible verses that say, tattooing is wrong. Right? But I'm just wondering whether the Bible actually says that tattooing is wrong. Right? Yeah. Okay, think about it. There's a lot of very interesting theological reflections. One is by Kevin Van Hooser that talks about the body as text, right? The body as text, and tattooing is only one part, one expression of how you use the body as text, right? You can engrave whatever pictures on the body, so your body becomes like a canvas. But the other interesting idea that he talked about is plastic surgery and even sex change. Could be really other extreme, right? So you can modify, you mod your body. So in a sense, the body is text in a broad sense of text, right? You can mod the body. And the question is, within that continuum, right? Within the continuum of the extreme of not just changing your body externally, so plastic surgery, maybe augmentation or whatever parts you have, maybe even hair, eyelids, plastic surgery, right? Yeah. Hey, you didn't notice I did one last year. But so within the continuum, what is acceptable and what is not? Okay, and I think that's a really great question for us to think through. It's not theoretical, because experimentation, all these things are very in the spirit of Gen Zs, right? So you will expect them, if you're a parent, you will expect all these kind of, not just questions, but hey, already done. you don't even consult the parent, then already have the tattoos of the body and things like that. So yeah, I think Amy from your church was my student, and she and some other people did a great project on this topic. Also, yeah, very insightful, thoughtful, balanced view. Yeah. Okay, so thank you for that question. Again, the answer was too long. Do we have time for you to go into your discussion groups? Or do you want to ask 1 or 2 questions? You want to do a discussion? I asked Pastor to help me determine.
Since you started this whole process, you can just do a thing of it.
Don't want. You're supposed to program, not me. So if no question, then we can go on. But yeah. No, seriously. Yeah. Maybe would you have time to get into the discussion? Yeah. So you can either do, since you all have the questions, and you can either do, or maybe this one is easier. This one is easier. Yeah? This one is easier. Why don't we just do that? Okay? So it's about your takeaways. Okay? So maybe just turn to your neighbor, and if just 2 of you want to join a group of 4, then just move to your neighbors. Yeah. Yeah, maybe 4 to 5. If you have any answers, that's why you have a pastor here. Yeah, Pastor Yang Mei. Yeah, just ask yourself, and then maybe you can put your question together. We can meet again next week, right? Is it next week? Are we taking a break next week? There's a break, yeah, very good. All right, thank you everybody. I hand over the time to Pastor Yang Mei.